Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to host Dr. Ragna Winniewski from the University of Cologne in Germany. Ragna has a PhD research project in which she analyzes how synaesthetical, which is multisensory concept of sense perception, are discussed in strands of phenomenology and cognitive sciences, and how these concepts are applied in multisensory therapy forms in dementia. She is co-founder of the network Transdisciplinary Research on Dementia and Aging at the University of Cologne, organizing a monthly reading group and lecture series with researchers, practitioners, and everyone interested in the intersectionary field of research. Adding to that, she has done research on resilience in illness and crisis, and more recently, she is involved with her colleagues in the European University for Wellbeing project, Reshaping Life Environments for the Elderly, also known as RELIEVE. Ragna, thank you very much for accepting my invitation, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation, Francesca, and I will start right away. Aging and illness do confront us with the gradually intensifying experience of how closely body and mind are entangled, if not to say inseparable. What early in life appears as self-evident, unity becomes increasingly fragile and disruptive when illnesses such as dementia challenge our bodily integrity. Dementia as a syndrome stands for a series of degenerative symptoms, which are accompanied by a progressive loss of memory and cognitive abilities. Hence, they can be regarded as extreme types of bodily transformations, and sometimes even as a loss of self. Whether these observations are right or not, they challenge concepts of personhood and the narrative self, as these are traditionally situated within the linguistic cognitive realm of consciousness and thus beyond our pre-reflective capacity of social interaction. This cognitive and biomedical view is problematic as it remains one-sided and primarily refers to deficits and not to remaining potentials of those affected. Philosophers such as Edmund Husserl, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Thomas Fuchs have stressed the lived body and dimensions of self-experience, which precede explicit memory and narrative self-attributions. Their concepts emphasize our sensory-motor anchoring in the world and our bodily perception as existential modes of social, interbodily, and synaesthetic being. Ethnographic studies with people affected by dementia show that bodily self is maintained even in advanced stages of dementia, through diverse embodied habits, as well as through spontaneous forms of bodily interaction and movement which allow for resonance with the social world. That is why feelings, moods, emotions, atmospheres, and the evocation of bodily expressive resonances, as well as the multisensory design of spaces, play an important role in maintaining the synaesthetic self and kinesthetic self as open to the world. Okay, so some more general words or remarks on my research. In my research, I addressed the question how the concepts of synaesthesia and kinesthesia challenge phenomenological and also cognitive models of perception, and how they can contribute basically to widening a theoretical framework from a phenomenological point of view. And then in the second part, I want to combine this to ethnographic studies and identify potentials of synaesthesia, as well as potentials of synaesthesia's related phenomena, which is kinesthesia, atmosphere, and empathy in this case, how they contribute to engaged phenomenology and embodied therapy approaches in dementia. So I follow here 4 broad objectives. The first one is that synaesthesia and kinesthesia to me are crucial phenomena of perception and of existential being, which contribute to understanding not just dementia, but in my case, dementia beyond mere psychological and physical losses and limitations. And second, I want to identify synaesthetic and kinesthetic forms of therapy that focus on the inter- and intra-bodily communication to create meaning and a sense of self. and other. And this can be done, for instance, via the body memory, which I will refer to later on. And as a third objective here for me is I want to create a holistic, that is a multisensory and embodied approach to illness that contributes to the psychophysical and social well-being in dementia. And last but not least, how do I do this? For instance, by creating this transdisciplinary network for dementia, which I've co-founded together with Eric. He's here today in the audience as well. And we basically meet on a regular basis with dementia scholars, but also practitioners, therapists, linguists from the field, and also for everyone that is actually interested in dementia and how to address this very challenging issue today. So today I will talk about synaesthesia and kinaesthesia within the phenomenological realm, and I will introduce them as basic concepts of the lived body, and also touch upon this debate or discussion whether they are normative phenomena of perception or whether they are exceptional phenomena of perception. I will then also go on and address synaesthetic and kinaesthetic forms within embodied therapy. Here I specifically think of multisensory environments in dementia care that can be found, for instance, also in therapeutic atmospheres, dance movement therapy, or snoozling. But first, some facts on dementia. There are, according to the World Health Organization, today 50 million people living with dementia worldwide, and this number will have tripled within the next 30 years. So it's a societal challenge we all have to face, and we perhaps find some answers to. The World Health Organization is defining dementias as complex syndrome of age-related chronic progressive impairment and deterioration in cognitive functions, which affect memory, orientation, learning capacity, language, and judgment, and which come accompanied by changes in mood, emotional control, behavior, or motivation. So it's no wonder, no surprise that they also come along with psychopathologies such as depression, anxiety disorders, or hallucinations, or sometimes even aggressiveness. So what the problem here is that we have a focus on in the diagnostic manuals as the ICD or DSM on the neurodegenerative aspect of the illness, but not on the potentials. So I call this here the biomedical view problem. It's a problem because it conceptualizes Alzheimer dementia and other types of dementia as loss of selfhood, and thereby it silences transformation of self-expression into symptoms of cognitive decline. And it also disregards our bodily agency and conceives of people's behavior as meaningless or acting. So in order to counter-view this or counterweight, put some counterweights, I'm dealing with synaesthesia and kinaesthesia here. So Stephen Sabatty is a neuropsychologist, and he's telling us he has worked for more than 30 years with people suffering from dementia, and he's telling us or giving us the advice we should forget memory loss. And this is a quote by one of his patients who said, "People will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel." And one important advice he was also giving us in a talk is that to recall is not the same as to remember. So I might not remember that if I'm holding a fork in my hand, it's called a fork, but I still know how to use it in order to eat my dinner or my dish in front of me. Thomas Fuchs is also a philosopher who's done some research on dementia and particularly on body memory. And he's saying people with dementia rely heavily on bodily memory, and they can even make new memories, i.e. so somebody with dementia can still learn how to dance in his later life, even if that's for the first time. So if we should forget memory loss, then the question would be, what should we focus on instead? And the answer is already out there. It is we should focus on the embodied memory with its kinaesthetic and synaesthetic nature. And as an example, you could imagine the so-called Proust effect, which is, I'll go a little bit further here, have it down there. There's a little picture. It's from Proust's work in Search for the Lost Time. It's basically the scene where he dips a Madeleine into a tea, and then this combination of smell and taste evokes his childhood memories back to where he comes from, to home, his hometown, so to speak. And it's a very pleasant atmosphere he's describing here, and the synesthetic effects that make him feel home or remind him of home, so to speak. So body memory by Thomas Fuchs is defined as the pre-reflexively lived social corporeality. It conveys a continuity of selfhood in the face of declining cognitive abilities. It is the implicit memory active here, which works without reflexive forms of self-identification, or it is also called a pre-thematic operative consciousness of the past expressed through the body. And there's 6 different types: the procedural, situational, intercorporeal, incorporative, pain, and the traumatic body memory. And what helps us to activate or strengthens the body memory are, of course, embodied habits. So something I learned in my childhood, for instance, cycling, swimming, or skiing is usually something that is ingrained in a procedural memory. I do not forget it, even if I haven't done it for 20 or more years, so to speak. And what also helps to evoke and strengthen the body memory is our multisensory environments. So that's just a quick overview on the definitions, because I don't know how far most of you are familiar with those 2 terms, synesthesia and kinesthesia. They stem actually from the ancient Greek philosophy, and it was no other than Aristotle who referred to synesthesia here as synaesthenomai, and basically describing the sensing together, but also referring to something such as sympathy and compassion. And today, synesthesia is also defined as the joint sensory, cognitive, or affective experience associated with seen, heartfelt, smelled, or tasted stimuli. Here you see already the entangled and multisensory aspect of this kind of perception and experience. And a more cognitive or neuroscientific way to describe synesthesia is here given by Vasovitz and Vanning. They say that it relates to the unity of cognition, demonstrating a certain holistic epistemic ability, integrating different mental faculties into a hypercoherently unified conscious experience. So the unity of consciousness through our bodily senses is, of course, very important, and it's also stressed by synesthesia. Kinesthesia, on the other hand, comes from the Greek term kinetikos and means of motion, and it refers to the awareness of the position and movement of the body parts by means of sensory organs and the muscles and joints. And I was just watching the other day a documentary on the proprioception, and there were artists that have an expert proprioception, so to speak. For instance, somebody was doing handstands and flick-flacks and they have a very well-trained sense of kinesthesia or kinesthetic awareness, so to speak. And so, as I already mentioned, those 2 terms actually tell us that our senses work jointly together, they're entangled. And Ian Hodder is an anthropologist saying that synesthesia and resonance are bodily processes that themselves see coherence across domains. They are powerful forces in creating unities and coherences that contribute to entanglements. So if we think of the synesthetic field, then we should imagine this as a complex, intangible, and interpersonal aspect or mechanism of perception and sense making. And of course, the entangled senses come along with engaged bodies, or they are mutually influence each other. And Pia Kontos, she's a pioneer researcher, ethnographer, but also sociologist in the field of dementia from Canada. And she's here describing the tacit knowledge of caring and embodied selfhood, and saying that the social cultural aspects of corporeality endow selfhood with the capacity for improvisation and spontaneity. Embodied selfhood is not mechanically constraining of action, but rather permits an element of inventiveness and creativity, albeit within the limits of its structures. which are the embodied sedimentations of the social structures which produced it. So what we've learned becomes an embodied habit, and usually if we're young, we start early on and we play around. So that's a very creative approach. We play with our senses, and that's usually also when we start to build our kinesthetic and synesthetic awareness, and it comes along, or it is mainly through improvisation and creativity here in early childhood. But what it also is describing a mutual attunement or alignment via a habitual, creative, expressive, and affective self. So synesthetic and synesthetic awareness and kinesthetic empathy is happening through engaged bodies and entangled senses. So I brought here an example of a kinesthetic self. You see Martha Graham. She was one of the most important dancers and choreographers in the 20th century. And that's a quote by her to Agnes de Mille, who wrote her biography. And it says there's a vitality, a life force, a quickening that is translated to you into action. And because there's only one of you in all time, this expression is unique. So I took this A because she's a good, of course, an excellent example of a person with a very high kinesthetic awareness as a former dancer, but also because she connects or expresses this as a form of vitality. And that again is something that Howard Stern has addressed as a core self, or the A, or transmodal perception. So again, here the link to synesthesia and also to our body memory that becomes active in performing the dance, so to speak. And then this is an example of Marta Sinte, who was also a former ballet dancer, and she's in her mid-stage. That was actually taken, the video was taken in the year 2019, and it's also unfortunately the year she died. And that, I think, makes very clear what the kinesthetic self is and what the potentials of a kinesthetic self are. So I hope you can see this and hear this one. Okay, could you hear this? Just a quick feedback.
Just the last seconds.
Oh, okay, well,
I think it maybe worked.
Okay, if not, you might try again next week. I don't know, I'm not sure. But basically, this is, she's performing here a piece of Swan Lake. As you can see, she has headphones on, given her by her therapist, and he's stimulating her body memory here via the music, but also via gently caressing her and inviting her to try to activate her kinesthetic self, but apparently also affective self, because in the end, she's telling him that was very emotional to her, to bring back to life her kinesthetic, her former ballerina dancer self, so to speak. Yeah. Okay, so what I want to stress on is, of course, the foundational corrective of kinesthesia and synesthesia for our lived body experience. So it was no other than Edmund Husserl who was saying that originally I move, I do precedes the I can do. And that was in Ideas 2, but he was also referring to the importance and how kinesthesia works in thing and space, early on. So it is one of the crucial concepts of how we perceive the world and how we experience it and ourselves immersed in the world. And then, well, yeah, later on, it was Merleau-Ponty who was stressing movement is, or the importance of movements, by saying that the joining of the sensible world and the world of expression comes about through movement. So movement is central. The kinesthetic awareness is central for our perceiving of the world. And then Sean Gallagher is an activist. It's another strand, so to speak, of phenomenology, and he's saying that the kinesthetic organization operating through the body schema now provides for the organized unity of the synaesthetic field. So they're interlinked. The visual field, the tactile field, do not become united noetically or consciously. They are already united for consciousness by the lived body. Thus, consciousness finds itself already surrounded by a meaningful world, one that is organized by the lived body. So that is a quote that to me expresses the foundational character of kinesthesia and synaesthesia for our lived body. It sums it up quite well. And for me, now it is interesting how I get from the kinesthetic I or the synaesthetic I, we all are, to a kinesthetic we or synaesthetic we. And yeah, I suggest we can do this by empathy and resonance, and which I called here synaesthetic reciprocity. And these are two forms of therapy I'm referring here that are used with people with dementia. One is, you may know, the validation therapy that was founded or created by Naomi Feil in the United States. And it's based on mutual incorporation and embodied shared practice. This is another example. You can see Naomi Feil here on the right-hand side, and Gladys Wilson is the lady in the chair, and it's actually also a very intriguing video where you see how they mutually tune to each other. You have to imagine that Gladys Wilson is in a very apathetic state when Naomi is entering the room, and she's approaching her, touching her gently in her face, and also taking her hands. Then she talks to her eventually, and she starts slowly to humming and also tapping some rhythms on the chair. And you can see how gradually Gladys, the person with dementia, is responding to this invitation to act and to collaborate in the synaesthetic and kinesthetic way. So the video is culminating basically that they sing together, which is completely impressive and astonishing. So what this validation therapy is also based on is a form of creative body therapy that has been named by Udo Bär like that. And this creative body therapy is focusing on our primary body movements, which are here looking and being seen, sounding, hearing and being heard, grasping and being grasped, pressing and being pressed, but also leaning. So what this apparently leads us to is a multisensory engagement. So synaesthetic reciprocity leads to multisensory engagement, and multisensory engagement can be understood in two ways. First, as forms of embodied prevention, as it is stressed by Gerd Kemperman. That's very important to prevent illnesses such as dementia, but of course also other dementias. And he's saying the most effective forms of multisensory engagement or kinesthetic or synaesthetically engaging with the world are dance movement therapies, playing theater, music, but also for dementia patients, therapeutic atmospheres become very important here. So the second aspect that where we find multisensory engagement as very important is it can be regarded as a means to reduce effects of disembodiment and also to increase well-being and so-called vitality effects or primary body movements. And that's just an overview of well-being effects when multisensory engagement was applied in care homes, and that about nine studies. and they show all that there's a positive mood and increase, and also the occupational engagement do increase. So there's more social interaction. People tend to be calmer when they are multisensory engaging with their environment. And yeah, so synesthesia is in the phenomenology of perception by Merleau-Ponty considered to be a normative way of perceiving. So he says synesthetic perception is the rule, and we are unaware of it only because scientific knowledge shifts the center of gravity of experience so that we have unlearned how to see, hear, and generally speaking, feel. So he's implying here that it's a normative body practice, and then he is also saying how he perceives or how he understands synesthesia. He says the senses intercommunicate by opening on to the structure of a thing. So we can see the hardness and the brittleness of glass, for instance, and when it breaks with a tinkling sound, the sound is conveyed by the visible glass that's broken. And then he goes on, but just to quote some more, one sees the weight of the block of a cast iron which sinks in the sand. And there you see how heavy, or you perceive how heavy the material is, or you can perceive the fluidity of water or the viscosity of syrup. As you can hear and viscerally feel when you hit cobblestone, either by a bike or here it's a carriage. So you bodily feel this via different senses. So that's just an overview to try to schematically explain that there's a varieties of synesthesia, and that's quite a contested field, so to speak, and mainly in the cognitive science, synesthesia is considered to be a phenomenon that is not normal or normative, but only prevailing in 4% of the people. But here, synesthesia is understood as something like, for instance, you see here the color grapheme synesthesia. If I would see a letter, any letter in a certain color, and that has to be stable over lifetime. Whereas you see on the right-hand side, the so-called metaphorical or associative synesthesia, and that is what we share with all the rest of the world, so to speak. So in the middle, you see the sound shape synesthesia, which was a famous experiment by Wolfgang Köhler. He was a gestaltist, psychologist in the 1920s. And he did this experiment in different cultures, in the Western culture, but also in some Eastern culture. And those two figures are called Kiki and Bube. And if I would call you, or would ask you now, which one would you call Kiki and which one would you call Bube, then you would, most of you, the majority would say the left, the zig-shaped figure is Kiki, and the rounded shaped figure is called Bube. And there you see there's a correlation between the sound and the shape, so to speak. That's called an associative synesthesia, or a cross-modal correspondence, it has been called. And on the right-hand side, you see here the mirror touch synesthesia, which becomes important in therapy approaches to cure phantom limb pain. So what you see here, which is probably hard to see, this is actually an arm put in front up of a mirror. So the right arm of this person is mirrored to imitate the left arm that is actually amputated, has been amputated, to integrate this phantom limb pain, because then he sees that the limb is still there, which is in fact not the case, but it is pain reducing. So the mirror touch synesthesia helps to reduce pain in phantom limb. Okay. Right, so how can we appeal to the synesthetic we? Is here, we're coming back to the quote by Merleau-Ponty, is not just by opening, I would argue, not just by opening onto the structure of a thing, but also opening onto the structure of the being of the other, so to the lived body. And this can perhaps done, or this problem can be solved by enactive accounts that has been described, or that describe or tend to describe synesthesia as an integrative form of sensory motor cross-modality and kinesthetic awareness. So Andre Abbott is saying here the problem of synesthesia seems to be solved, or is beginning to be solved, once we recognize that in perceiving objects as offering opportunities for action, subjects might be in a state of bodily preparation to take up these opportunities. This might lead to a quasi-sensory experience related to a given modality without a corresponding stimulus. So this is basically referring to what Husserl called the anticipation or suspension of possibilities for action, or Gibson called affordances, and Alvanoe termed action in perception. And to sum up the first part is I would identify here potentials of synesthesia as they are challenging or complementing the normativity in perception, but also hierarchization and modularization of our sensory modalities. And they contribute, or synesthesia contributes to theories of embodiment via the body memory, and also to applications of synesthetic stimuli in therapy. And what is even more important here is the type that's called affective synesthesia. Again, we think of the Proust effect, which would be an affective type of synesthesia. And Emmerich is another researcher that has worked with synesthetes, a neuropsychologist, and he calls this almost a way of living or lifestyle, which enables new access to the world of emotions and the deep inner relationship. So it appeals to richness and diversity of our lived body and multisensory environment. It also gives a sense of orientation and of identity. And last but not least, it contributes to an embodied cognitive approach to dementia. And if there are varieties of synesthesia, you might have already guessed, there are also varieties of kinesthesia that we can identify here. And one is described by Maxine Sheets Johnston and also by Thomas Fuchs and Sabine Koch. So basically, kinesthesia is here seen as an experience of movement, but it's also should describe the qualitative dynamics. So then we begin to understand the varieties here. And this can be done by kinesthetic empathy. For instance, researchers could notate body rhythms that may be used to analyze affect attunement differentially. So that we have to be aware of a gradual attunement as not just philosophers, but also as therapists. For instance, if you want to treat anxiety or depression, because on the one hand, if somebody is suffering from anxiety, you would want to calm him down, so you can't give a rhythm that has a high intensity. That would be counterproductive. On the other hand, if you had somebody that suffers from depression and you want to help him, then you would have to come with some stronger stimuli, so that have a higher intensity. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to move forward. Okay, so that brings me the varieties of kinesthesia and the gradual attunement become as also implied in what I call here embodied resonance, and Thomas Fuchs and Sabine Koch have described as interbody resonance. And they can also be seen as shared embodied practices, for instance, in making music together or dancing, but also as forms of existential resilience. And they call for an attitude, or embodied resonance calls for an attitude that accepts vulnerability and is constitutive based on openness, while repulsion, on the other hand, describes a world relationship for inner hardening and closure, according to Hartmut Rosa, who's a famous sociologist dealing with resonance here. And embodied resonance is also to be seen as a precondition to make sense of and adapt to or transform mute or repulsive moments, for instance, in illness. And we shouldn't account for silence as mere absence or non-existence, but silence is always expressing some kind of affective state of being. So Embodied resilience is here referred to as bodily responsivity, according to Bernhard Waldenfels, another quite famous phenomenologist. And we could say that it's a bodily responsivity. Even silence can be a bodily responsivity, as I said before, that should go beyond the image of disembodied spirits or deanimated bodies, which is here a provocative term, of course, but as dementia has the problem of facing the problem of having that stigma that people die a social death and exactly become a disembodied spirit and or deanimated bodies in the end, in the final stages, that we need some counterexample of how to destroy this image or to understand it in a different way. And here embodied resilience would help if we understand this as an ability to relate to and to engage or to resonate with rhythms and moods that can be emotional, kinesthetic, synaesthetic, of the other's fragmented existence in a specific situation, thereby creating new meaning during after transformative experiences. So it's a meaning generating process here again. And what are meaningful moments in illness? What can they look like? Well, Sarah Campbell, who did her research in old age care homes in the UK, says here, I regularly recorded atmospheric moments of resistance, which emerged as regular disruptions to the normative scheduling and structuring of the care environments, bubbling up during both institutional time and in between time. They were sometimes affective and would produce ripples that could become palpable and could be felt in the air. At other times, atmospheric moments were experienced as currents of resistance that were felt when someone refused to take part in an activity, which may have accounted for a shift in energies in the environment. These atmospheric shifts produce and create the emergent atmospheres that are always becoming. So she was doing research on atmospheres in care homes, and I like the aspect that she calls this atmospheric moments, because atmospheres is another very synaesthetic phenomenon, which is here defined by Thomas Fuchs as holistic affective quality of spatial environments or interpersonal situations in which their physiognomic, synaesthetic, and dynamic features are integrated into a unified gestalt. And synaesthetic experience to constitute the experience of atmosphere. And they do so by bodily resonating with others and the world. So atmospheres seem to be very crucial when it comes to therapy. And that has been actually framed by Jan Sonntag. He's a German music therapist working with people with dementia. And he is called Therapeutic Atmospheres as crucial. And I might go here, move a bit forwards, because he has identified the potential and the problem of therapeutic atmospheres, as he's saying that there are decreasing cognitive abilities. On the other hand, there are increasing receptivity to atmospheres. So he's referring here to Tom Kitwood, who says that particularly vulnerable in relation to harmful malignant atmospheres, but at the same time receptive to beneficial benign atmospheres. That's exactly what Sonntag is describing here. So that means we have a heightened awareness of pre-reflective modes of existence and interbody communication that can contribute to create those meaningful affordances. And I'm coming back here to that last hint on the slide, the kinesthetic we. There's one example by Sonntag where he's referring to an old man who's hurrying down the ward, being apparently very, very nervous, and he's running from one end to the other. And Jan Sonntag was working there as a therapist in that moment, and he was, of course, asking himself what to do, how to intervene in a proper way. And he could have asked him something and talked to him, but instead of talking to him, he just took up the pace of that man, and he was basically attuning to this rhythm. And while walking jointly or hurrying down jointly the ward, the man eventually calmed down. So he did this by bodily resonating with this person. And so meaningfulness in illness can be achieved by addressing or creating therapeutic atmospheres, as seen by the example I just described, but also by embodied habitualizations, shared practices, and interbody agency, as was clear in the example of the Marta Sinter, the ballet dancer, the former ballet dancer, but also in the example of Gladys Wilson and Naomi Feil. And Jo Reichert is saying that participants in situations produce their meaningfulness through bodily activities and common habits, thereby co-constituting a temporal situational order in shared action. He's actually doing ethnographic research with couples suffering from dementia, and he's trying exactly to identify their kinesthetic or synaesthetic we in this situation. And last but not least, despite a degree of unshareability, the vulnerable and resilient lived body is a relational and affective self with resources of bodily expressiveness, engagement, and ethical responsiveness, I would argue. And this, I'm coming to my conclusion now. So I've tried to identify and describe synaesthesia here and kinesthesia as resources to stress our pre-reflective, relational, and resilient aspect of self, and to incorporate them in shared embodied practices in dementia. I would argue for them as resources for bodily coherence to encounter feelings of disembodiment, and they're also resources for creativity, heightening body memory, and effective communication. And they allow for more playful or right responses that are open to improvisation, or also to an access to the hidden sense and meaning within asymmetrical encounters, if you want to call them like that. And last but not least, they also help to create interpersonal meaningful affordances within a specific and sensorially stratified situation and context. So meaning is generated through several layers of self and levels of embodiment that can be affective, cognitive, habitual, and social. And the phenomenological and existential view of dementia is complementary to biomedical models by accounting for the affective and relational nature of the self. That means the vulnerable, resilient, perfective, and intercorporeal lived body, which are always co-constituted. Thank you for your attention. So I'm looking forward to your questions.